Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today from Porto Alegre, Brazil is Daniel Cunha. Daniel, welcome to CivilNet.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I think this is the first time that we've had a guest talking to us from Porto Alegre via Skype. We've asked you to talk with us today about the World Cup. You are a co-editor of a newspaper called Sinal de Menos. You are also an engineer. You have a master's in environmental science, and you have been actively protesting the World Cup taking place in your country. Why are you protesting?
Well, Brazil is still an undeveloped country, still a developing country. And what we think, many people here in Brazil think, is that the expenses with the World Cup, they could be much better applied. Because in Brazil, we still have lots of problems with public services, with health, with education, with public transportation. And we think, many people think that it is not fair when poor people in Brazil, when public services are so bad, that so much money is spent on the World Cup. And more than that, there are several problems related to the organization of the World Cup. For example, 8 workers died during the constructions of stadiums and related infrastructures, and 250,000 people were evicted due to infrastructure constructions, and also other problems. So we think there's the problem of priorities in public investment, and also in the organization of the World Cup, which includes, which is very cruel, the gentrification, complete gentrification of stadiums and the World Cup itself. If you think about the prices of tickets to the games and the minimum wage in Brazil, we see that only the rich and the upper middle class can go to the game. So it is a World Cup that is very good for FIFA's earnings, and it is made for the rich, while public services in Brazil are very bad, and even these poor people, they can't even go to see the World Cup matches.
Right. I understand, Daniel, and I think that perhaps it could be fair to say that with most huge global sporting events, whether it's the Olympics or the World Cups that have taken place for decades, there will always be those in those particular countries that see the problems. But is it not true that the World Cup can bring a large amount of revenue contributing to your country's GDP? Is there nothing that's positive about what's taking place?
The thing is, it's not really being positive for people who are in more need of social services. For example, FIFA is getting a tax exemption. It's getting tax exemptions to make the World Cup, equal to 1 billion reais or $500 million US dollars, and the costs, the buildings, the social works that would be done with public transportation, for example, most of them canceled or are postponed. So most of the things are really done for the rich to go to the World Cup, even with exception rules around the stadiums where people cannot protest. I can cite for you one example why it is being really bad for poor people. During World Cup matches, there are extra buses for public transportation to go to the stadiums. But then on the next day, this is in my city, in Porto Alegre, and in the next day, you have less buses for people who need to work, for poor people who spend 2-3 hours per day to go from their house, from their homes, to their workplace and to come back. They spend 2-3 hours per day in a bad public transportation system. So we have better transportation system for rich and upper middle class who's going to the games, but then you have less transportation for poor people who really need it to go to work. So it's a gentrified event, and it's not being good for public services in Brazil for people who really need it.
Right. Now, Brazil is a very, very big country. It's almost 8.5 million square kilometers, 200 million people. What is the percentage of poverty in your country?
Well, I don't have the exact data, but I can have some figures. For example, about 50% of houses don't have sewage systems, or we don't have enough hospital beds. The World Health Organization recommends 4 beds for 1,000 inhabitants, and we still have 2.3. So we really need to develop more to completely eradicate poverty.
Prior to the start of the games, I had a discussion with Brazil's ambassador to Armenia, and I asked him, in 2007, when Brazil was granted, the right to host the games, it was at a time when Brazil's economy was expanding. There was, inflation rates were under control. 7 years later, in 2014, we had the global financial downturn and the economy constricted. So people were quite upset, and there were a lot of protests. We would be following on international news networks the amount of protests, but those protests seem to have diminished, I guess with the excitement of the games, and in particular because Latin American countries were beating European countries. Has that been the case? Have you seen that?
The protests are certainly not as huge as they were in last year. There are several reasons for that. One of them, I would say these protests against the World Cup, they are part of a broader cycle of protests for public services. It started in 2013. Actually, it started the protests were related to public transportation. And then the World Cup came in and was included in the demands of the people. But one of the reasons why the protests now are not so big as they were is just police repression. Many people who were involved in the protests last year about mainly public transportation, but also about the World Cup, they were indicted by the police. It's clearly a political prosecution, but they were indicted by the police so that they are intimidated not to protest now. And we also have exception rules that was demanded by FIFA and accepted by the Brazilian government, so that protesters are treated as terrorists during the World Cup. We can be indicted as terrorists.
I think perhaps the problem also is the way FIFA conducts itself, or the way it deals with those governments that are hosting the games. Could you not say that as well?
Of course, FIFA demands a special rules and special laws during the realization of the event. And we have a huge police apparatus in every single protest. They're using very intimidating tactics. For example, I was in a protest about 5 days ago, more or less, in which the police completely encircled the protesters, and they just didn't let people move to march. As soon as we try to move, they throw tear gas bombs on us. So this is, for me, a clear reason why protests are much smaller now. And of course, Brazilian people love football, so this is for sure a reason why the people are not protesting so much. And we have a huge media around that is...
But I was thinking, just as we were having this conversation, Daniel, that while I understand certainly the frustration that you and others like yourself share with them, perhaps as demanding that the money could have been spent toward improving public infrastructure, hospitals, and education. But at the same time, the World Cup, with all the media attention focused on Brazil, it also provided you with a platform. This conversation that we're having now from, Yerevan, that's thousands and thousands of miles away from Brazil, we're having this discussion because of the World Cup.
Yeah, that's right, and I think this is the best of the World Cup. In a city like in Porto Alegre, we rarely have visitors from foreigners, and it's a good thing that they are coming here to see the games. But I would say also that the cities in Brazil are being gentrified for the World Cup, and that the image that many foreigners are having of Brazil is not the real image. They are not seeing real poverty. they are not seeing the real problems that Brazil is having. And we also have some other problems. For example, feminist groups are denouncing sexual tourism and sexual exploration and child prostitution. So I think we love football, and we really think that this is an opportunity to show Brazil to the world, but the real Brazil, not a fantasy Brazil that is being sold off as as something that is not real.
Right, right. Well, Daniel, I want to thank you very much. It's really been an enlightened conversation for me, and I certainly share the frustration. We live in a developed country, and of course, you're so much bigger than Brazil is so much bigger than Armenia is. But we still probably, as global citizens, have the same issues and problems that we face, regardless of geography. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to talk to us, to shed some light on why there is a certain segment of Brazilian society that is protesting these games. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest from Porto Alegre, Brazil, was Daniel Cunha. Thank you for watching CivilNet.